If you're on the other side of the United States in geopolitical terms, I think when you see Trump implementing these policies, you should probably be gratified because, I mean, he's damaging America's position in the world. He's, I mean, hurting other countries, but he's hurting, I think, America most of all.
Hello, Mr. Ronald. Hello, guys.
Hi, Professor Shi. I'm very glad to hear, very honored to be on, your show and talking with you
My
about
great
those
pleasure.
important issues. I think the notion of simply a ceasefire without a longer term peace agreement is obviously something that the Russians would find unacceptable because there have been a whole series of individual temporary peace agreements, which really never went anywhere. Minsk I, Minsk II. For example, the Russians were persuaded to pull back from Kiev very early in the invasion on the grounds that there was about to be a settlement agreed to, and it never came about. So, in other words, I think the way the Russians handled it was Putin's response was very deft. In other words, he didn't reject the notion of a ceasefire agreement, he accepted it. But he said, well, we have to go through all the details of the possible ceasefire agreement, what it involves. And in a sense, given all those details he raised, I think the likelihood of a simple ceasefire agreement being implemented is almost nil. In other words, Putin, in a sense, rejected the proposal, but rejected the proposal in a very deft way to make it seem that he'd accepted it. What the Russians want, obviously, is a much broader peace agreement that involves a neutralized Ukraine, a demilitarized Ukraine, and the sort of agreement that they'd come very close to getting just a few weeks after the after the war started. So it seems to me the Russians are handling things very effectively. And I certainly hope there is a peace agreement, and it all really comes down to whether the American government is willing to implement a peace agreement of the sort that Trump had promised when he was running for office.
Yes, in my point of views, just you mentioned, it's a proposal. And that means what we really need is kind of agreement with very sophisticated and concrete steps, which can push the situation moving toward the status named the ceasefire. But according to the IR series, according to those analysis on why the war started and how this war ended, we will find today the ceasefire proposal raised by the United States is kind of impossible triangles, which means it's including several points which cannot be achieved together. Point one is kind of ceasefire. Point two is they want the Russia to accept it without condition that the battlefield situation, actually Russia is taking great advantages. The United States did not have enough tools, frankly speaking, to pressure Russia to accept the ceasefires and abandon the battlefield advantages, which means de facto such kind of ceasefire, especially a temporary ceasefire, will become nothing but kind of time windows for the Ukraine side to rearm itself with the military aid from the Western, and that definitely will leading to the final breaking of the temporary ceasefire by the Ukraine side if they believe they are prepared enough again and have enough confidence and the resources which they needed to fighting back Russia on this battlefield to ensure finally this battlefield status will become advantageous for the Ukraine side rather than the Russian side. And finally, the last point is no matter what kind of content and ways that Trump's side raised the ceasefire proposal, one of the most important goals of this proposal is to ensure that the United States will become the final winners, at least in the US domestic politics. That means even though Washington will put great pressures on Kiev's side, the Trump administrations cannot accept the final result that make people believe such kind of ceasefire or even agreement means a total surrender to Moscow from the Washington side. It means it will providing the Kiev leaders enough confidence, he can fighting against any pressures from the Washington side if he believes such kind of ceasefire or peaceful agreement will mean a total surrender to Russian side. So even the United States can use very tough policy tools like cutting off intelligence sharing and temporarily halted military aid to the Kyiv side. The US cannot just do nothing and waiting the Kyiv side being totally defeated on the battlefield. That makes those proposals are very tough jobs for the Trump administration's foreign teams to sell to both Kyiv side and the Moscow side. So today, what we see is there's a so-called ceasefire proposal raised by the Washington, and the Washington tried to push it to accept it by both Ukraine side and the Russian side. But both sides use different tacticals, de facto rejected these peaceful proposals. So nowadays, I think it's kind of stalemate on this ceasefire negotiation process. There's a lot of terms on the negotiation tables. Moscow did not send in a very clear reject, but it's a kind of de facto reject. From the Kyiv side, after the meeting in Washington, Zelensky definitely changing its diplomatic negotiation policies toward Washington. He used very softened terms, but he actually modified the conditions and the terms raised by Washington on these ceasefire proposals, adding a lot of conditions, including asking the Moscow side to return so-called of the children from the Ukraine field after the conflict began, which means a nearly mission impossible for Moscow to accept these conditions. He used a very soft but very decisive reject to this peaceful proposal. So in future, I'm also quite curious how Washington can push forward the so-called ceasefire on this battlefield without changing its first priority goals. That means just stop this conflict as soon as possible so that the United States can definitely stop providing military aiding, which become more and more tough burdens for Washington in today's period. And also Trump can say that it got very important diplomatic winnings by during this process. I think it's a very tough challenges for Trump's teams, and just to wait and see how this situation will develop in future.
I would strongly agree with that. I mean, the whole point is that on the battlefield, the Ukrainians have been defeated. In other words, the war is lost. Russia has, in effect, won the war. They're moving forward. Their, military strength is growing. The Ukrainians are being basically defeated. They, they've lost nearly their entire pocket in Kursk. And so it's a very strange thing. When a war is being fought, the losing side cannot say we'd suddenly like a ceasefire to rearm, to re-equip, to strengthen ourselves. I mean, in other words, it's not the sort of thing that actually would happen. There's no reason for the Russians to agree to it. The only reason I think the Russians were willing to, in effect, soften the rejection they made by saying that they accepted it subject to all these other conditions is they do want to reestablish normal relations with the United States. In other words, they're hoping that Donald Trump will be willing to reestablish regular relations with Russia. And so to the extent that they don't want to alienate Donald Trump, they were willing to, in effect, go along with this proposal, but in a way that, amounted really to a soft rejection. For example, one thing I heard is Trump had sent his envoy, Witkoff, a New York billionaire, to meet with the Russians on this. And supposedly he was kept waiting for 3 hours. In other words, basically as a sign of the Russian dissatisfaction with the American proposal. I mean, the American envoy was basically kept cooling his heels for 3 hours, which is, not the sort of thing you do when you're indicating you're happy with what's going on. I mean, the problem is that Donald Trump had run for the presidency, promising that he would be able to end the war very quickly, almost immediately. And there's no sign of that really happening. In other words, basically, the Russians are certainly not willing to concede to his proposal. They're not willing to allow a militarized Ukraine to remain in place, to be rearmed, and to restart the war in a year or 5 years' time. And so for that reason, I think the Russians will still keep on moving forward on the battlefield until the Americans force the Ukrainians to agree to what the original Russian terms had been. In other words, a demilitarized, neutralized Ukraine that will not ever become part of NATO. I mean, that's basically what the Russians have been asking for from the beginning. And, in particular now, several of the oblasts of the provinces of the Ukraine have now been officially incorporated into Russia. And the Russians are certainly not going to return that territory. In fact, I would think that part of the agreement might require the Ukrainians to leave, to basically remove their forces from those portions of the remaining territories that they still control, which would obviously be a sign of Ukrainian defeat. So, I mean, the bottom line is the Russians have won the war, and I think the Ukrainians have lost the war. And I mean, there's no way that you can massage that reality through the sort of diplomacy that Trump is aiming for. So, I think basically it's a question of whether the Americans are willing to recognize the reality of what happened on the ground or not. And it's a difficult thing because, I mean, you have an enormous sort of ideological infrastructure that's built up in America and the West on the notions of the Russians being weak, the Russians being easily defeated, the Russians losing the war. And it's hard to admit that that was all propaganda, dishonest propaganda from the beginning to the end. In other words, from everything I've heard, the Russian economy is doing really quite well, much better than anybody had expected. The Ukrainians are losing on the battlefield. And we've seen, for example, that the entire West is unable to produce military munitions of the sort that are needed in an ongoing war like this. In other words, Russia's basically outproducing nearly the entire West, which is ridiculous. So I just think I don't see, these Trump proposals going anywhere unless Trump finally recognizes the reality of what's happened in the war, that the Russians have won, the Ukrainians have lost.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。